Learning the first Sikha of Parshas Noach in Chelek on page 13. The shir today is being learned with Nishmas Rabbi Yosef ben Yamin ben Rabbi Menashe Koltman. Oifem Pasik b'tchilas Parshasenu Eila told Noach ish tzadik tamim hoye b'dereisav. The pasuk in the beginning of this week's parsha where it says that Noach was a tzaddik, but he was a b'dereisav in his generations. Zanada tzvei pirushim. There are two interpretations what the emphasis of b'dereisav is. Rashi bringt b'pirush el Torah, and Rashi quotes them in his pirush on Torah in a diuk from b'dereisav regarding the word b'dereisav. Yesh Rabbi saying l'shvach. Some of our Rebbes darshan this word b'dereisav as a praise for Noach, that even in his generation he was so great. And v'yesh darshan chulu, and there are others that say that it's the opposite of a praise. Now later deye as b'dereisav meant nit l'shvach. What is the understanding of the opinion that says that it's not a praise for Noach? Zogan Razal, Virashi is mefarish. So Razal tell us, and as Rashi says this, L'fidoiroi hayetzadik. If you measure who Noach was in his generation, according to the standards of the people in his generation, he was a tzaddik. But v'ilu hayi b'doirish shel Avram, if he would have been in the generation of Avram, lo haya nechshav l'klum. So looking at who Noach is and his level of tzidkus, comparing to Avram, he would be considered to be nothing. That's why it's saying that only b'dereisav he was a tzaddik. Isn't it glatik der loshin ilu hayi b'deirish shel Avram? So what's not smoothly understood over here is, how could Chazal tell us if he had been in the generation of Avram, indicating that he was not. Avram is geboren geworden nun ches shana lufnei misas Noach. Avram Avinu was born 58 years before Noach passed away. With the simon from Even Ezra, the simon that Even Ezra says, Avram Avinu ben Noach kashameis Noach. The Noach being the same name as Noach, so he was 58 when Noach passed away. Is doch Noach gewen am meshach zman b'doirish shel Avram. If so, Noach did live an extended period of time in the generation of Avram. Although we could simply answer and say that in the beginning of Avram Avinu's life, he did not yet seemingly reach to the complete level of being a tzaddik. Bis as steht in Medrash, to the point that the Medrash tells us, Avram Avinu, or Avinu Avram, mispached v'oime, that he had a fear, and he would say, would we say that I have a sin for all those years that I served Avodah Zarah? And only at a later time did he come to recognize his creator, to come and serve Hashem. So we can say that in this time period that Noach was in Avram's generation. Avram was not yet the Avram we know, the tzaddik. However, noch farzman ben Noach shona, but definitely, according to all opinions in Chazal, which will soon be quoted here, before Avram Avinu came to the age of 58, he already recognized Hashem and began serving Hashem. And he came to this recognition all on his own. As the Rambam says and speaks about this at length in the beginning of Hilchos Avodah Zarah, Avram is von sich allein zugekommen zu wissen Makke sein dem Eibishten, how Avram Avinu all by himself was exploring and used his kayach to understand and come to the recognition and conclusion that the Eibishter created this world. And he had nobody that taught him about this, nobody that let him know about the truth. He just all taught himself. Nidvi Noach, now this is something that's unique by Avram. Unlike Noach, by Noach, whatever knowledge or whatever recognition he had of Hashem is visis mashma nit given b'koyach atzmai. As it seems from the commentaries, this was not on his own. And we find that it says regarding Sayyida Ibur, astrology, or how the calendar works. From who did Noach learn this? As hat es gelernt von Chanoich und Mr. Chelek, sein Seiden. That he learned this from Chanoich and Mr. Chelek, his grandfather. So it's understood that he probably learned also about Hashem and things like that from them as well. Aber befragt, wie der Rambam schreibt, especially according to what the Rambam says, as Mr. Chelek hat gehat bis Medrash, Mr. Chelek wasn't just a tzaddik for himself, but he also led a whole bis Medrash. Und a Bezdin, he also had a court, a Bezdin. is doch sicher, as in Haupt Einikel, Noach, definitely one of his most important grandchildren, Noach, Is given dort and gelernt dort. He was there and he studied in this bis medrash of his grandfather. So he had who to learn from. And at Mekabel von andere Farim, he received the truth, the understanding of the truth from those before him. Und al derech zeh is euch de chilik b'negeya zeh an hage. Similar thing we could also say about the difference between Avram Avinu's behavior and Noach, both as a tzaddik, but still not on the same level. As Rashi here says, Noach hayitzarech tzad l'toimchai. Noach needed support to support him in his connection to Hashem. Aval Avram hayimizchazik v'hoylech b'tzidkei meilav. Avram Avinu was much stronger, much more committed in his tzidkos, that he was steady and strong on his own. Okay, this is a side point here, but the point is that according to all opinions, Avram Avinu came to his recognition of the Eibishter at a stage before in his life, before he came to the age of 58, and he came to this all on his own. Is masim tzazagin. So then how can the Chazal tell us that ilu hayi b'dayre shel Avram chulu? If Noach would have lived in the time of Avram, in the time when Avram was a tzaddik, b'shas as Noach is yegeven amashach zman in im doyer von Avram, Noach did live a period of time in the same time as Avram Shem Nochdem, the Avram Hikeres Beire, and also in the time period after Avram Avinu recognized Hashem. Now, furthermore, the Rebbe explains here, Afilim is all taichin. As Doire Shel Avram meant, when it says here the generation of Avram, what is this referring to? And so this is referring to, and this begins, Nit von Zman Avram Zavede mit sich. Not from the time that Avram Avinu was serving Hashem and had his own personal recognition of Hashem. Nor von Zint hat aufgetan mit andere. Rather from the time period when he came and began teaching and influencing others. As the Pasuk says, as ha-nefesh asher asu b'charan, that the souls that they influenced and brought from Charan. Only the Gemara sagt, as dafke von demelt, the Gemara tells us that it's only from that time when he began teaching others, that is, die Shnei Alafen Teire. It begins a new time period of creation, the period of the 2,000 years that are connected to Matan Teire. So seemingly, so then we could say that Noach did not live in this time period, yes, after Avram Avinu recognized Hashem, which was earlier on, but not in the generation of Avram, generation referring to the influence that he had on the people in his generation. But this also is not a sufficient answer. Is doch euch der Auftu gewähnt, kame Jahren vor Mises Noach. This accomplishment of Avram teaching and influencing people around him was also a number of years before Noach passes away. Wie the Gemara sagt, the Gemara tells us, Gemiri da Avram by Yishaite bar Chamshin v'tarte have. We know that when it says Hanefesh Hashose b'Charan, when did Avram Avinu begin teaching everyone about Hashem? It's when he was 52 years old. And again, Noach passed away when Avram was 58 years old, so that leaves a number of years where they shared together in the same generation and in the same time period once Avram Avinu was not only a tzaddik for himself, but even teaching others. So here in Siv Beis, the Rebbe actually brings the various opinions that there are in Chazal regarding at what point Avram Avinu came to recognize Hashem. Wegen dem Gil, when Avram hikeres beirei, zeren dok kametes. Regarding the age when Avram came to recognize Hashem, there are a few opinions. Ben Gimel, it says in the Gemara that when he was 3 years old, or Ben Mem, when he was 40 years old, which the Rambam says, that we'll see shortly. Ben Mem Ches, or Medrash, it says when he was 48 years old, or Ben Nun. In another Medrash, it says when he was 50 years old. The Rambam in Hilchas Avodah Zarah sagt, the Rambam in Hilchas Avodah Zarah tells us, Ben Arbayim Shana Hiker Avram es Beirei, that Avram was 40 years old when he came to recognize Hashem. Zoktev dem der Ravid, so the Ravid says about this age, that the Rambam says that Yesh Agoda, that there's the Agoda in the Gemara that tells us Ben Shalei Shanim, that Avram recognized Hashem when he was already 3 years old. Shenema Ekev Ashasham Avram B'Kaili Minyan Ekev. Ekev, Avram Avinu lived 175 years. So Ekev is Gematria 172, which means 172 years out of his life he lived and recognized and served Hashem. Meaning not the first 3 years. So from here we know that when he was 3 years old, he recognized Hashem. So now the Kesef Mishnah is Masber. The Kesef Mishnah explains the Rambam's opinion, and he actually says, as Fishel zeh v'zeh, it's possible to say that both of these ages are true. The Ben Shalosh Shanim Haya Keshehischel Achshav Chulu. When Avram Avinu was 3 years old, that's when he began thinking and exploring, looking for what this world is about and who's the creator, lahake beire, to recognize Hashem. Aval Keshahaya Ben Arbaim Hishlim Lakire. When he came to the age of 40, that's when he came to the full recognition of Hashem. So both are true. Now, Rabbeinu kosav ve'ikr shugmar ha'akeda. So the Rambam chooses the age 40 because the Rambam is telling you the main point here where Avram reached to, that he came to a full recognition, the Hanik Yeshoya ben Arbaim Shana, when he was 40 years old. Now, another point the Kesef Mishnah says is V'tzarech loymar shahaya geiris ben Arbaim. We must say that he had a girsa in the Gemara or in the Medrash that brings this, that Avram was 40, even though in the Medrash that we have, it says that he was 48. Not 48 as it is in the Svarim that we have. So this answers the Rambam. What the Ravid says is true. Avram Avinu began exploring when he was 3, and he continued until he came to the complete understanding of Hashem at the age of 40. But therefore, however, what we need to understand over here about this age that the Rambam says, is since the most accepted version that we have of the Medrash is that Avram Avinu was 48 when he recognized Hashem. So why did the Rambam decide to choose seemingly a version that's not so accepted or is not found in most Sfarim, that no, it was dafka at the age of 40 and not 48. There must be something significant about this age of 40. Another point we need to understand is to further understand here a little bit deeper the point that the Kesef Mishnah says that what the Rambam says is true and what the Ravid says is true. Since it's possible to say that both ages, 40 and 3 before that, are both true, side ideas ben shalosh hikers bayra and side ideas as given ben arbaim, und der Rambam allein red betchilas halacha wegen dem wie Avram is given bekatnusai. And the Rambam, if you look at what he describes there is, he begins to describe what Avram Avinu did in his youth. Kivin shenigmal eson zeh hischel sheitet bedaitai v'hu katan v'hischel ashrei. So the Rambam there himself begins to talk about what Avram Avinu did when Avram Avinu was very young and he began to think and explore. So the Rambam doesn't skip that point of Avram Avinu's life, he begins with that. Is verwas der Monte nicht befeidisch, as in der Zeit, wenn hischel ashrei cholu, is gewähnt ben shalosh shanim. So if he does agree to what the Ravid says, that we know what that age was, 3 years old, and the Rambam talks about that time period of his life, why does the Rambam not mention what that age was? Like he mentions later when it comes to the time when he came to the full recognition, there he gives an age, but over here, for some reason, when it comes to the Hischil, he doesn't mention an age. Why not? Okay, so here the Rebbe will give us a lengthy introduction from Siv Gimel going forward, explaining what the Rambam tells us in the beginning of Hilchos Avodah Zarah, all about the history of Avodah Zarah and what Avodah Zarah is about, and who Avram Avinu was, and when he came and introduced the truth into the world. And the Rebbe will explain at length what the Rambam is doing, talking about all of this in a Sefer Halachos. And based on this deeper understanding of what the Rambam says, we'll be able to come back and understand the age that the Rambam chooses to say when Avram understood the Eibishter, and then to come back what it means that Noach did not live in the generation of Avram. We'll understand all of this by first introducing and then explaining what does the Rambam tell us in the beginning of Hilchos Avodah Zarah. In the Merishon Perek, hyped on the Rambam, in the first Perek, the Rambam begins to describe it was in the generation of Enosh that people made a very big mistake. And he goes on to describe what the mistake was when they were beginning to think who is ruling this world and how things are happening in creation. After the Rambam explains at length their mistake is in Messiah. This is the main source and root of what Avodah Zarah is. That's in the first halacha. The Noach is a mamshech and halacha base. Then the Rambam continues to describe the history, seemingly, of what happened at that time in halacha base. Then, when there were many days, many years that passed, so there were false prophets that got up and said to the people that they got a command from Hashem to serve this and this star. And the Rambam says the details and describes what happened, how big people began to serve certain stars. Und es mevai bariches, wie mis später herunter, bis zum niedrigsten Schlaf von Avodah Zarah. And then later on, the Rambam explains how this then went even further down, how it all deteriorated to the lowest level of Avodah Zarah, which the Rebbe will bring later in the Sikha and explain the various levels of how it all went down. Then the Rambam says, as the days went on, a very long period of years, the great and holy, awesome name of Hashem was totally forgotten from all people, from all creation. There was nobody that recognized the truth, that Hashem created the world. There were very single individuals in the world, handful of individuals that recognized the truth. In this way, the world was going forward in a negative fashion, until the pillar of the world was born, and this is Avraham Avinu. When an halacha gimel is a mevaya ba'arichis, then in the next halacha, and halacha gimel, the Rambam explains at length Avram is how Avraham Avinu came to recognize Hashem. Und wegen aller meisten Vinyanim Neilim, was hat getan nachdem, and then about all the great things that he did following this, einzupflanzen dem Ikir Godel Hakaras Habayre Vavidasa in Herzen von Alofen V'Revavis. How Avraham Avinu worked hard to ingrain this truth in the hearts of thousands and tens of thousands of people. Be'ez ideally Yitzchak Benai, and he taught this to his son Yitzchak, Yitzchak ideally Yaakov, and Yaakov taught the truth to his son Yaakov, Yaakov limit bon of Chulu, and Yaakov taught his children, and then the future generations. Und wie es ist gewähnt der Matze von Bnei Yaakov, bis der Eibishter hat geschickt Moshe Rabbeinu und gegeben die Mitzvahs zu Yidden. And then Rambam goes on to explain what happened to Yidden when they were in Mitzrayim, and there Yidden almost lost their identity and their true understanding that they had from their ancestors, from Avram. And then finally, the Eibishter sends Moshe Rabbeinu, and the Yidden received the Torah and Mitzvahs. Das alles mit einer Arichis Gedeila. The Rambam goes through all of this history with a lot of details at great length. Now, the question here on all of this is, was l'chayr is das nit muvam? Seemingly, this is not understood. The Rambam is a sefer von halachis. The Rambam is a sefer where he says just halachis. Wie der Rambam schreibt bakdomas sifreis. The Rambam says when he explains it, he's writing a sefer and he's dividing it into halachis. Nit kein sefer was the zel divrei yemei olam oder afilu divrei yemei Yisrael. It's not a history book, not even to speak anything about history that relates to Yidden. So what is the relevance for halacha, this entire length here that the Rambam speaks about on this page? How it all went down and it evolved from one level to the next in the time of Enosh and further. Until finally Hashem chose Yidden as his inheritance and gave them the crown with mitzvahs. And notified Yidden how to serve him, and how to judge and deal with all those that make the mistake to follow Avodah Zarah. How and why is all this relevant for Hilchas Avodah Zarah? Seemingly the Rambam should just come and teach us the halachas of Avodah Zarah. Mishpat Avodah Zarah, v'cholatayim achareh. That's it. But the history, how you get to this point, is not relevant for halacha. Now the Rebbe adds as follows: Wenn the Rambam would makten given, if the Rambam would have first said, as Adam Erishan is nitztav geworden al Issa Avodah Zarah, that Adam Erishan was the one that was first commanded on this Issa not to serve Avodah Zarah, and it's an Issa for Adam, and it's an Issa for all people, not only Yidden. So then it would be possible to answer, even though this itself is also a deichik, as Arichas Hanal is nit negeya to them what the Rambam schreit weiter in Perik Beis, that all of this whole history that the Rambam writes here is not relevant for the halachas that the Rambam writes. Again, so you could say, let me read this again, as Arichas Hanal is negeya to them what the Rambam schreit weiter in Perik Beis. Then we would be able to say that all of this history here is relevant for what the Rambam writes later in Perik Beis. And it's not in the beginning, it's somewhere in the middle, in Halacha Daled of Perik Beis. There the Rambam mentions, if you made an Avodah Zarah, you deny everything in Torah. And in everything that all the prophets were commanded, beginning from Adam until all the end of time, the end of the world. So here the Rambam says that Adam Arishon was already commanded, and this is something which is relevant to know that Avodah Zarah is not just something which is Oster for Yidden, but it's already something that began from Adam. That's why the Rambam brings this history. Even though it's still a deichik, I mean, the Rambam has to go through this whole entire arichis, but it would be possible to say that this is why the Rambam brings this up. An additional point, which is actually relevant to halacha, since even Bnei Noach are commanded not to serve Avodah Zarah, so therefore here, with this entire length the Rambam speaks about, what it's clarifying is, even though the history and facts are that for all these generations, the people did serve Avodah Zarah. This was just the way people behaved in the entire world. So you may make a mistake and think that Avodah Zarah is a chiddush starting from Matan Torah for Yidden, like other mitzvahs. So therefore, no, they have their mit given of Tzivi Hashem. So therefore, the Rambam has to clarify that this is not the case. Avodah Zarah is also for Bnei Noach as well, and whatever happened in history was an Oster. They were over on the command of Hashem that was given to Adam. That would be a good answer if the Rambam had began this whole history that he says there with the point that Adam Arishon was commanded not to serve Avodah Zarah. Der Rambam aber der Mund nicht in dem ganzen Perek as Adam Arishon is nestav geworden of Avodah Zarah. However, the Rambam never once even mentions this point here in Perek Aleph, where he talks about all of this, that Avram was commanded not to serve Avodah Zarah. And it was bechlalet madgish dem Geudel isse bedava eichen yanim zmanim. The Rambam doesn't at all highlight or mention the fact that how great the Issa was in those times. He just tells you the facts of how things evolved and how Avram Avinu came along and set things straight. If it all comes out as the Hemshich ubariches siper on yonim in ganzen Periken is lechayre bloiza siper more reis. So the whole story and history that the Rambam teaches here seems to be just a story about what happened. Was hat kein Sheiches nicht zum Sefer Hayad von Rambam. That doesn't belong at all in a Sefer Hayad of the Rambam, was in Yonah is halachas. The focus and the only thing that Rambam brings is things that are relevant for halacha. So the question remains, why does the Rambam go through this whole arichas of history of telling us what Avodah Zarah is and how Avraham Avinu came and changed that? So in Sivdala, the Rebbe will begin to explain that here the Rambam is showing us a very fundamental point about the Isra of Avodah Zarah. V'yashleima as the Perek Rishon from Hilchas Avodah Zarah, the first, in other words, the first Perek being the first as in the foundation of all of Hilchas Avodah Zarah, V'arichas in Yonah, and all of the details and the length that the Rambam says here is a Hagdome Klalis to alle Hilchas Avodah Zarah in Rambam. This is a very necessary and important introduction for all of the halachas of Avodah Zarah that the Rambam says following this. The Bib's explanation here is as follows. Chet von Avodah Zarah. What is the Aveir of Avodah Zarah? Chachas b'chlalus b'shteiter von isurim b'negei l'maisa. Even though in general it consists of things that are forbidden in action, ubepayil, and things that you do in actuality, not just things in your heart or mind or things in potential, but things that you actually do. Avodah Zarah, it's called Avodah, someone that serves. Service is an action. Is aber, however, toichnoi ve'ikroi verbunden mit machshavas ha'adam hirir alev. The content and the main essence of what Avodah Zarah is all about is not a physical action, just the physical action itself, empty of any connection or serving of Avodah Zarah. That's not what Avodah Zarah is all about. The main point of the Avodah Zarah is the thought in the heart and what a person is thinking about, or what a person in his heart is connecting to. The fact that a person could think in his heart and mind, as a nivra, that any created being, a malach or any angel, galgalchul, or any of the galaxies, is an alikah, has any level of godliness to it, or even any intermediary with any power, has any level of independence. This is the essence of Avodah Zarah. Avodah Zarah, if the Rambam would just begin Hilchas Avodah Zarah, go straight into the halachas, don't do this, don't do that, don't bow down, don't serve it in this way or in that way, then it would limit the concept of Avodah Zarah in halacha to just the actions. But that's not, it's missing the main point here. The main issue of Avodah Zarah is the machshave v'hirur halev. That a person gives significance to something other than Hashem. And here the Rebbe clarifies that it's not only that there's nothing else that's an alikah, but even just to say that there's something else which is a sirsur or a mitzias, some intermediary that has some significance or some independence. This as well is a clear isser, as the Rambam says. I mean, the Rambam is mefaret, and the halach is gleich betchilas perik beis, as the Rambam says, following the whole description and history of Avodah Zarah and perik aleph. So in perik beis, in the beginning, the Rambam begins as follows. The main point of Avodah Zarah is not to serve any creation, including not an angel. And even when one that serves an angel or any other entity knows that Hashem is the true God, and what he's doing is similar to what Enosh did, that he knew that the Eibishter created the world, but still he gave attention and served other powers in creation. This is part of what the Torah warns and says, not to serve Avodah Zarah. Kalaima meaning shemetoshet ba'ayin lipchat tire. You may look with your eyes, with your heart, and you'll see she'elu heina manhigim esayla, that these are powers in nature that are conducting matters in the world. Ve'im shechalak Hashem ma'isen chulu, and Hashem gave them a certain independent power. V'toyim asharoy l'shtach v'slem lo'ivna, and therefore you'll say that it's befitting to bow and to serve them. And this is what the Torah says, that it's not allowed. Don't even have a thought in your heart to serve any of these powers in nature. To be even just an intermediary, some kind of a power between you and the Creator, the Eibishter. So that's part of the machshava, the isser of Avodah Zarah, the essence of Avodah Zarah is the mistake that you give a significance to any other thing or power in creation. Uninvited halachas is a mamshech. Then later on, the Rambam continues. It says, "As tzivanu hakadosh baruch hu shel likros ba'osten hasfarim v'egen Avodah Zarah." Being that the isser of Avodah Zarah is not just an action, but the main point is what the person, the perspective and the ideas that a person has in his heart and mind. Therefore, part of the isser of Avodah Zarah is also not to read in any of the books that explain and define and talk about Avodah Zarah klal. Not to even pay attention to think about these foolishness. Anything that will lead to this. The isurim, the lavin that there are in all of this is all at one point. Don't even allow yourself to turn in your heart and mind in that direction towards Avodah Zarah. And we're not only talking about Avodah Zarah, that one may not turn with his heart towards. Similar applies also when it comes to other Yisurim in the Torah, when a person does thinks in a direction with different opinions and ideas to go away from Torah. So what do we see clearly here in the Rambam? The Isser of Avodah Zarah is not just the action, even though that is the actual Isser, but it's the content here, that's the main thing, the machshava, that a person has a wrong perspective about nature and about the powers of nature, that there's something other than Hashem which has some significance and some independence. That's the essence of Avodah Zarah. So now, therefore, what comes out here, the Rabbi concludes here based on this in Sifei, the fun is move on. So from this it's understood. As b'chdei zum mekayim zenke deboi the mitzvah leisesa ve'esa von the din and Avodah Zarah in order to fulfill properly. Both the mitzvah leisesa and the essay not to serve Avodah Zarah is nit genug to wissen belois the halachas b'negei l'asiyah. It's not sufficient just to know the halachas that are relevant for action, what one may or may not do. Was man darf tun, was man tarnet tun. Nor adarabba, on the contrary. Nor actually, this is the main point here is l'chol l'roish. First and foremost, the place where you have to be sure that the person is pure and has no connection to Avodah Zarah is what the content of Avodah Zarah is really about. It's not about an action. It's the machshava, that a person doesn't actually, in his heart and mind, consider anything else significant besides Hashem. That explains why the Rambam gives such big attention and devotes almost a whole pedic to discuss what the essence of Avodah Zarah is, what the mistake and what the wrong, foolish thoughts that lead to Avodah Zarah are, to understand that this is actually the essence of the Isser of Avodah Zarah. It has to be very firmly established in a person's thought and heart. That any creation in the world has no entity for itself. There's no independence of anything that exists on its own. There's no room to give honor to anything, to give any significance, or God forbid to serve any creation in the world, as powerful as it may seem to be. No angel, no galaxy, no malach, no star, none of the elements of creation, nothing. No creation has any independence on its own. That is the essence of Avodah Zarah, that a person should really understand this when he looks at nature, that It's all really created by Hashem and nothing has any independence. The Yisayrim is that furthermore, the Akdomet to Hilchos Avodah Zarah is Negeya zum Kiyum von alle mitzvahs. This introduction here is not only relevant for Avodah Zarah itself, but it's actually also very important and relevant for all mitzvahs by extension. For in that upbeaten mitzvahs Avodah Zarah is Ikka Kol mitzvahs Kula. To have this straight, to have the right thought and the right perspective about the Eibishter and creation, that it's all belongs to Hashem and there's nothing independent, this is the foundation of a Yid fulfilling all of Torah and mitzvahs. Und der Rebbe is the Rambam macht dem ganzen Perek alle far die Hilchos Avodah Zarah. So therefore the Rambam gives this whole long introduction over here in the first Perek about Hilchos Avodah Zarah. Onay midik from bimei enesh chulu tov bnei adam chulu chachmei Oster der. The Rambam points out that there was a mistake, and who made this mistake? There were wise individuals in that generation that made this mistake. One is Masber, and the Rambam wants to explain so we understand. As their Tos is bestanden darin, was sie haben gemeint, what was their mistake? What did it consist of? That they thought, as the Eibusher created these great powers, stars and all other powers that there are in creation. The Rebbe is roim is also mechabed m'shabech sein. So it's befitting to honor them and praise them. Bis zu bayim fazeh hechalis and dinazeh chwana letzlan, to build for them hechalis and build things and to serve them. God forbid. That is, so the Rambam here is explaining logically where how this all came, what the root for the mistake was. Why is the Rambam going through all of this and explaining over here al piseichel, logically what happened? So here there's an additional point. The mitgit the Rambam zu verstehen. With this the Rambam, with all this harichis, what he's explaining us is as the ikir, the sibbe von Avodah Zarah, that the main cause of Avodah Zarah, euch, wie es ist gewesen bei Meyenesh, wenn sie haben damit gemeint, lahasig rotzen abeire bedeite mara. Even in that time period, when their intention originally was that they had the intention to understand what the will of Hashem is. With their foolish mind, they didn't have the right approach. Is mufrach. Second, let me just make sure I read this correctly here. Is mufrach nit nor mipnei tzivoy ogzeiras Hashem. So their conclusions that they came to is not only something which can be refuted and should not be accepted because, well, Hashem commanded that we should not accept this approach. Nor does this hepecha emes v'metzias. The Rambam wants you to understand that this is actually factually not true. This is the opposite of reality. Hepecha seichel, opposite of logic. Das hat sich genommen in the form was tov b'nei adam tos gadol. This is a result of just a simple, huge mistake that they made. Wissen die kshatul v'adecha, knowing that Hashem is the only one. Then as they durchgefallen, so they knew this, that Hashem is the only one that created the world. Then as they durchgefallen, chet Avodah Zarah tzlib ta'usam v'ksilusam shemedamim shezeh hevel ritzeinchohu. And then they came to a conclusion that it's the will of Hashem, that these powers of nature that Hashem created should be served. This was the great foolishness. So the point that the Rambam is trying to make over here is, in order to completely eradicate any room for Avodah Zarah, it's not enough just to say, well, logically, there's a room to argue, like what the people in that generation, the mistake they made, may be true. Elamai, the Eibishter commands not to follow that opinion, not to follow that approach. So then you're not uprooting Avodah Zarah from its source. That means that logically there could be room for Avodah Zarah, chas v'shalom. So therefore the Rambam is going through this and explaining to you that this was all a mistake even logically. Factually and in reality, there's no room for this at all. That completely uproots in the machshave and in the leiv of the person that there's no room to even think in this way. It's like 2 + 2 = 5. It makes no sense at all. On b'halacha beis, and then in the next halacha, here the Rambam goes through various different levels, how this evolved from level to level. And the Rambam here describes 3 different stages, how Avodah Zarah evolved. Bringt der Rambam areis die niedrigere und ärgere Eifanim von Avodah Zarah, was es einen da. The lower and even worse levels of Avodah Zarah that there are. Sagen as akel tzive ivdu keichev pleni. That when you had the false prophets that came and said that Hashem commanded to serve this star. And then the priest that came along and said that if you serve this will bring you success. Or that the star itself spoke and said, serve me. Then they came to the point where they said that the stars themselves can do good or harm you. And all of this was, of course, false prophets that came and said these foolish things. So what the Rambam is saying with all of this, why the Rambam is bringing the next step of how Avodah Zarah evolved is, as the tos, b'machshave, u'belev anal, that the mistake, the original mistake that they made, when they said, well, it's the will of Hashem that we give honor and credibility or some significance to all of these great powers of nature that Hashem himself created. Hashem wants this. But what did all this lead to? This brought them down because it was all a mistake, even just logically in reality. So what this led to is, led them to then serve Avodah Zarah to a degree which is not something which is a mistake logically that they made. This is something that has no connection to any seichel at all. Just simple falsehood, just false prophets that literally made up things. So that's the second step of how Avodah Zarah came down and evolved. So the Rambam wants you to understand, he's telling you here all these details, how you should see to what extent Avodah Zarah is so refuted and so completely senseless and baseless. And das bringt Seif, and then the Rambam goes on to say the third stage of what happened, how Avodah Zarah evolved, zum Ganzen vergessen alle Kadosh Baruch Hu, that they completely forgot about the Creator of the world. This is given damalt as it came to the time period, came to a time when they forgot about the Eibishter that created all of the world. As besibas dem Taz Gadol, that it was all caused by the first great mistake that was made in the time of Enosh. And that time they believed in Hashem. And they thought that they're fulfilling the Ratzon Hashem by serving all other creations. Then came the next point where there was a generation where there was Nevi'ei Sheker that literally made up things about serving stars and so on. And all of this then, the original mistake, once you go off and you're logically doing things that are opposite of reality and you're making a mistake, this will eventually lead to the lowest level to completely forget. They went from lower and lower, bis zum Matze vom Vergessen und nicht wissen, as es da bei der Elam Manigai. They came to a point that they completely forgot about any creator of the world and anyone that is running things in the world. That is what the Rambam describes is, so you should realize, sometimes you may think, well, the extreme low levels of Avodah Zarah, that may be something which is completely senseless and baseless, even al pi seichel. But there's other aspects of Avodah Zarah that are more subtle than that, and that's something that we need a tzivi of the Torah to tell us not to serve on that level. The Rambam is telling you, no. The first mistake of Avodah Zarah, how it began, that leads to the second stage, and that leads to the third stage, midechi al dechi, because it's all one big taz gadol. Even just logically, it's opposite of reality. Noach dem alam is the Rambam Meisav l'tayr ba'alacha gimel. Then the Rambam continues and describes in the third halacha, how did Avraham Avinu come to recognize Hashem? And this is also a very important point to understand how Avraham came to this, to appreciate how a Yid could come to completely get rid of any machshava of Avodah Zarah completely. But das bringt der Reis noch mehr. The way that Rambam describes this expresses even more, wie bei ein Adam darf sein muchrig, euch mit zat seichel, jeder Reifen von Avodah Zarah. How, by every person, it must be completely out of the question, any form of Avodah Zarah on any level. And that is, what did Avraham accomplish? Avraham hat sich gefunden zwischen Avodah Zarah und Karua. Even though Avraham Avinu was living in a time period where Avodah Zarah evolved to its lowest degree, as explained before. Everyone forgot about a creator. Even more so, Avraham Avinu was serving with them. Und von deswegen, nevertheless, is gewend der was hissig derech ha'emes, Avraham Avinu simply came to understand not a command from Hashem. He came to understand the truth of reality. He was thinking and he came to understand. And he came to an understanding and he saw the mistake that everybody's making. He simply came to understand that Rabbi emphasizes the word truth and what's just, what's real. So here, there's two things. Number one, as low as you may be, you may even be in an environment that's so low, like Avraham Avinu was. Nevertheless, every person has the ability to come to this, even in such a situation. And how? Not only by accepting a command from Hashem from above, but even logically, you can come to this. Meaning, if it's logical and it's just the facts, so this completely obliterates any machshava of Avodah Zarah. Furthermore, the Rambam is eich mit Taye beprati is via ze Avram is to them gekommen. The Rambam, it's important for the Rambam also to explain in detail how Avram Avinu came to this. That this wasn't by some command, but Avram Avinu was exploring here with Seichel. Avram Avinu was exploring and wondering, how could this world, the galaxies and everything that's happening go on constantly? And there should be no leader, nobody that's causing this to go around. Impossible that everything is running on its own. And his mind was wandering and exploring, and he understood. What is the Rambam? Why is the Rambam going through these details of not only that Avram came to this recognition, but how he came to this recognition? Das heißt, as die Brie Gufe is machriach und is megala den derech emes. If you only look close and analyze what you can see in nature itself, it shows you the way of truth. As yesham alaka echad, it is one God, v'hu manega galga, v'hu bara koil, and he conducts everything and he created everything. So this is an additional point that is necessary for the Rambam to say. The Rambam here wants you to understand in Hilchas Avodah Zarah that the essence of Avodah Zarah, or the Isser of Avodah Zarah, is to refute and to get rid of any trace of any machshava of Avodah Zarah. Therefore, the Rambam says that this is something which al pi seichel it can be understood. It's the opposite of any mitzias of emes altogether. And another point here, the Rambam says the mitzias of what you can see in nature itself brings you to this conclusion. Welt itself says so. That's the degree of how much Avodah Zarah is completely baseless and senseless. Was das als Kanal? So this entire arichis, with all of these details, are all bringing you to the recognition, to understand to what point Avodah Zarah is so completely baseless. This is all a hagdama and a yisaid and echatel from Hilchas Avodah Zarah. This is an introduction, and actually also even a part of the halachas of Avodah Zarah. Nit nor is das moil poil. As a yid zal sich sitten von Avodah Zarah b'maise. So not only understanding the mistake of Avodah Zarah will definitely be beneficial for a person when it comes to Avodah Zarah b'maise, not to serve Avodah Zarah, understanding the foolishness of this behavior. Now das tut oif ubeike, but rather what this accomplishes, and primarily the point here is as b'machshavto ubeliboy, that in the person's mind and heart, so nikve werden the emes, that it should be very clear, the truth, was verhit, and the main point there is that there's no room even for this Aveda, because it's something which is so stupid and so baseless. So as besichle vet beimnis amis as alle nevroim habenit kin shom mitzias v'chshivas mitzadatzma ukanal, and this all has to bring a person to the recognition not only on the more lower levels of Avodah Zarah, but even the most subtle degree of Avodah Zarah, even just to give any level of significance to any creation, any metzias, any independence, that all of this is out of the question, as the Rambam goes through the various stages of Avodah Zarah, that it's all based on one big mistake. That's why the Rambam brings up all of this, because this is all a chelek of Hilchas Avodah Zarah. The halacha of Avodah Zarah is this itself, to get rid of any trace of Avodah Zarah in machshav and leiv. That is the ikar of Avodah Zarah. So now, based on all of this, the Rebbe comes back to explain why, when the Rambam talks about when Avram Avinu came to recognize Hashem, he chooses the age of 40 years old. So the Rebbe continues in Sivav, Apizekem amaz bezayin, was the Rambam at Beiche given the Girse, uben arbaim shana hika Avram is beirei. When Avram was 40 years old, he came to recognize Hashem. Unit the Girse ben memches v'chayetze bezayin, he doesn't choose the more common Girse found, which is 48. The next was is time a boy. In addition to the fact, there's an explanation needed. This is an additional point that the Rebbe didn't clearly ask before. So he was after the Rambam B'chlal sagen, the alter is dan given. Why would it even be necessary to give an age at all? The Rambam could just say that Avram Avinu came to recognize Hashem. Durch dem kommt zu in der Asbara vad Gosha now from Shlilas Avodah Zarah. Because by giving this age, this also adds an explanation and emphasis to the point to what degree Avodah Zarah is completely baseless. Regarding the age of 40, it says in the Mishnah, as ben arbaim lebina. When a person is 40 years old, he has the full understanding. Das heißt, what this means is, as be'ezman de grech zu de elte von arbaim shana, when you come to this age of 40, kommt men zu mitzat tivoi. This is human nature. So ashleimus and avanav asagi, you come to a full and proper understanding of things. This is not something, some kind of a gift or some kind of a miracle, but this is the human koyach of seichel is complete at the age of 40. Al derech vi ben shloshim l'koyach, the age of 34, the might, the physical might of a person, shalif nezeh, is an inyan in teva adam, that's just human nature. Val derech ze ben chamish l'nikra, the age of 5, for learning shalafonov, learning chumish, umechamishim le'etza, the age of 50 that is, for giving advice, and meshishim l'zikna, for old age, by 60 years old. These are all things, stages in human nature. Shalach rezeh. So the phone is move on. Why? So therefore now we can understand why the Rambam says his age of 40. Because from this we understand that the Avana Vakare in Mitzias Habayra, the understanding, the recognition in the existence of Hashem, or in the Shlilas HaMetzias Vachshivas V'nadavas Ulasi is Barach, and to what degree any other existence or any other significance is completely negated, is completely not true, is an inyan was verbunden mit Teva von Seichel HaNivra. This is something that nature, the human nature of a person's intellect sees this, understands this. This is not something that Avraham Avinu came to by some kind of a miracle, some kind of a spiritual koyach that he had, spiritual power that he had to come to this. This is with seichel, with the shleimus of seichel that he had, he came to the shleimus of this understanding of Piteva. That Avraham Avinu, he comes to recognize a seichel recognition. This is at the age of 40. This is the age when a person's understanding is complete. And this fits with the entire theme of what the Rambam is trying to explain over here in this entire Perek regarding a person understanding to what degree Avodah Zarah is totally baseless and senseless, as the Rambam describes with all the arichas, and this detail here regarding Avraham Avinu is also relevant. Even though it's definitely true, even according to the Rambam, the more years in a person's life, the older he becomes, the more wisdom he has. At the age of 50, Avraham Avinu definitely grew in his understanding and recognition of Hashem. Ben Memches at the age of 48, or Nun 50, or furthermore, different ages, as it says in the Medrash. But that's not relevant here for the halacha, for the point that the Rambam is saying here. Move on. With this, we could also answer the question we asked before. Now it's understood. Was the Rambam der Montnit betchilas halacha as Avraham is given ben shalish ben hischel lachshoy v'l'shaytis b'machshavtoi? The Rambam does not give the age of 3 when Avraham began to think and explore with his mind about who's the creator of the world. Und damit hat sich angegeben der Inyan von Hikeres Beire. This was the beginning of his recognition of Hashem. Why doesn't the Rambam give this age? Because then there would be room for a mistake to think that the fact that Avraham Avinu came to this is not the human nature of intellect to explore and see this. This is totally miraculous at such a young age. Totally beyond intellect, that even if he's only 3 years old, is shown by him given a karan elikos. He already had a recognition in godliness. Must be something supernatural that Hashem gave Avraham this gift. So therefore, the Rambam does not mention it. Even though this is not the case, when Avraham Avinu was 3 years old, the Rebbe brings in the Ha'aris that at the age of 3, Avraham Avinu was a very, very wise, and he was able to think and explore on his own. But if the Rambam would give this age, it may have given the impression to make a mistake that this was supernatural. And that's not the point that Rambam is trying to say here. The Rambam wants to show you how the approach of Avodah Zarah, the opinions of Avodah Zarah, are completely baseless on every level in intellect, in reality, in the Metzias of the world. The Rebbe continues and completes this point here in Siv Zayin. With this point, with this intention here, is the Rambam mamshich weiter in der halacha. The Rambam continues and explains in the halacha here. Meidechem mefaret via ze Avram. How Avraham Avinu began answering people that had questions. And then how Avraham Avinu was convincing and teaching people. And the main thing that Rambam is focusing on is larich din. He explained things to them. He proved it to them. And therefore, because of this, he was very influential. And to the point that the king then, Nimrod, wanted to kill him. He would go and call and explain people from one city to the next. The Rambam says he brought people back to the simple truth. Not some revelation of a religion from a mitzvah, from just the truth of what the world is. Thousands and tens of thousands of people gathered with Avram. Those are the people of the household of Avram. And he implanted, he ingrained in their hearts that they should also understand this great truth. And this is all durch rayes v'achreichim sichliyim. This is all by intellectual proofs. He brought thousands and tens of thousands of people. And this is the only way you could ingrain it in their heart. This brings you to the full extent of understanding to what degree Avodah Zarah is negated, and to bring the real full truth and understanding of the Eibishter in the world, how everything else has no significance, since the Eibishter is the only true being. This is the teichen of what the Rambam is saying. Okay, so after this entire introduction here, and we understand all of this, now the Rebbe comes back to explain what it means when Razal tell us that Noach was not in the generation of Avraham Avinu. So in Sivches, the Rebbe says as follows: Al pikol zeh mavur inyan anal. So now, based on all of this, so the point is that we said before is understood as ilu hayi b'doire shel Avram lo haya nechshav l'klom. That if Noach was in the generation of Avram, he would be considered to be nothing. What does it mean when it says doire shel Avram? So yeah, the point that the Rebbe said in the beginning of the Sikha is true, that the emphasis over here is the doir of Avram. We're not just talking about the lifetime of Avram, because Noach lived in the time of Avram for 58 years. And we're not only referring to a time period where Avram Avinu began to recognize Hashem, but we're referring to something else, the doir of Avram. And based on the long explanation here, we can understand what is meant by this expression of the doir of Avram. Da vet nit gemeint as legabe Avram atzmoi lo nechshav l'klom. It's not saying that if Noach lived in the time of Avram himself, it would be nothing. No legabe doire shel Avram. We're focusing here on the doir of Avram. What does this mean? Und doire shel Avram meant. Now, what does doire shel Avram mean? The generation? Nit die Zeit. It doesn't only mean the time when Avram is geworden meforsim bedoire durch hanefesh ashasa b'charan. It's not only referring to that time when Avram Avinu already had a great influence on people in the city of Charan. That was when Avram was 52. Noach was still alive. Nor b'shas der doir is geworden doiroi. Rather, it's a time period when the generation became Avram Avinu's generation. What does that mean? Behesim zu dem derech von Avram, that they went along with the way of Avram, to daitoi shitosei v'anagasei, to his approach, his opinion, his behavior. This was not yet accomplished, although Avram had a great influence, but still they weren't fully followers, and you can't consider them to be the generation of Avram at that time point, when he was still in Or Kasdim, over there in Charan or in Or Kasdim. Was blois, as the Rambam there says, in that time period, Gavar Aleim B'Rayesav. There, Avram Avinu was still arguing with them, and he overcame them with proofs. He disproved them. Not that they came around and really followed Avram, but he overcame them with his proofs. And even at a later time period, when Avram Avinu already came to Charan, that's also not yet the generation of Avram. This was at a much later time. When he gia l'Eretz Canaan, once Avram Avinu comes to Eretz Canaan, and there he calls Hashem, Shenema, as the pasuk says, Vayikra Shom b'Shem Hashem Keil Olam, and he calls the name of Hashem there. Acheniskaptzu Elav Alafim Uruvavais. All the tens of thousands of people gather to Avram, Vehem Anshe Beis Avram, and these are the people that become part of the household of Avram. And then V'shosal B'liba Mekar Gadol Hazeh. Now it's ingrained in their hearts. This is the time period when it becomes the doir of Avram. And the Rebbe clarifies why. Seemingly even earlier, in Charan, he not only overcame them and argued with them with his rayas, but he already influenced people. They were followers. So why is it dafka when Avram Avinu came to Eretz Canaan and then Shosal, he ingrained it in their heart? What new happened at this time? So the Rebbe explains as follows. The Raiv to them is, the accomplishment here is as follows. As their akoras habayr is given, their recognition of the Eibishter was, nit nor durch dem was Avram hat sie menatzeach given. Not only by the fact that Avram Avinu won the debates, he overcame all the arguments, he proved it to them, as it was in the time period, even when he was still in Ur Kasdim. But at that point, as it was already explained before, it doesn't mean that it became his followers. It's just that he refuted all their foolish opinions. Nor in an Eufen, was sie haben mekabel gewesen, bis Sichlom die Asbaris v'chachas von Avram. And even when he was in Chodon, it's not enough the fact that they accepted logically the things that Avram Avinu told them, because the fact that they're accepting what Avram Avinu is telling them, it's not really their own personal opinion. It's not really ingrained in their heart. They're still listening. They're accepting what Avram Avinu was saying. As Rabbi says, it's still, their recognition of the Eibishter is still an added feature to what their original approach was. Originally, they didn't believe in any of this. That was just the way of life and the way of thinking. And now they have this new idea that they're accepting from this great person Avram, but it's not them. It's not their own personal opinion. And so they're just, again, accepting it from Avram. Von dem was Avram hat sie reingegeben. Avram Avinu is implanting in them this idea, but it's not their own idea yet. Nor rather, Shossal belibam. When Avram Avinu plants it in their hearts to the degree hatten sie eingepflanzt die Akaran Yediyah Balakus. It's planted in their heart. It begins to grow in them. It's ingrained. It becomes part of them. Die Akaran Yediyah Balakus. This recognition of the Eibishter. Das ist bei sie geworden an eigene Sache. That they recognize it and know it on their own. Al derech vi by Avram, as explained before at length regarding Avram, that Avram Avinu came to all of this not by some command from above, from the Eibishter, not by some outside kayach, but it all was within, its own seichel, was through and through that he understood that this is reality. They came to this full understanding of the Eibishter with their own personal intellect. They came to these conclusions and they felt like, this is my seichel. This is not Avram Avinu's opinion that I can hear and accept. This is my opinion on my own. That's the real time period, which is the Deir of Avram. Und demol des Massen zu sagen, das ist Deir shel Avram. That's the generation of Avram. Avram's Deir, that they all are on the same level like Avram himself. As der Deir is given durchgenommen mit Akara von Elokos, al derech vi Avram. That they are completely permeated with the recognition of Hashem on the same level like it is by Avram himself, where by Avram, it's his seichel, that this is what he sees, and they also come to see it on their own. If he says, move on, the Lashon, Elohai b'deir shel Avram, this is understood why it says over here, if he was in the generation of Avram, while der matzev adeir is given la'achrim ma'is Noach. The generation coming to this level was after Noach passed away, once Avram was in Eretz Canaan, when Avram was given b'shnei sashivim, when Avram Avinu was already in the years of in the 70s, long after Noach passed away. So this we understand the point of the Deir of Avram, that when the generation comes to the same recognition like Avram himself. Okay, this concludes one inyan of here in the Sikha, which really answers all the questions that were asked in the beginning of the Sikha, and especially the main question regarding Noach. But here the Rebbe will continue now and explain what was brought up here in the whole introduction to explain regarding Noach and the generation of Avram. So the whole inyan that the Rebbe brought up, what the Rambam says in Hilchas Avodah Zarah, and the Rebbe will explain another very important point, the flip side of the coin regarding negating Avodah Zarah fully. The whole point that we learned over here in the Sikha till here is all about the fact that it has to be so powerfully negated and refuted that it has to be al pi seichel with the etzem etzias and reality and so on. Here, though, in the Rambam, we see that there's a lot of details that Rambam says which highlights and emphasizes the exact opposite point. And here the Rebbe will explain this. Let's see, Sif Tes. Based on all of this, we need to understand what the Rambam says in the continuation in Halacha Gimel, where the Rambam sagt, where the Rambam explains now what happened. As Nochtem, wie die Bnei Yaakov sind geworden an Umashi Yidas Hashem. The Yidden became a nation that knew Hashem from what they heard from Avram, then Yitzchak, then Yaakov, and so on. At she'olcha Yom Yisrael b'Mitzrayim, then Yidden were for many years in Mitzrayim. Is behemshach lezeh geworden ashinui. Then there was a big change. V'chazru lilmud maseyen. The Yidden turned back and learned from the deeds of the people that they were living with in Mitzrayim. V'laved avodah zarah kamois and chulu, to serve avodah zarah like them. Ukemat kot hoya ikesh shas lavram nekar. And it was a very little left that the whole entire tree that Avram planted here, or all of his children or grandchildren that were following in his ways would have been completely cut off from this truth of Yedias Hashem that they had. That's what the Rambam says. Now, based on everything we said before, brengt es heraus dem Heipich von dem Teichen von dem ganzen Perek. This point over here actually shows something, the opposite of everything that was said till here. Which means, as the Mensch mit Satzichloi Gufe is Yedeya, the Abgefreckkeit von Avodah Zarah. Before, the whole point over here is that every person could and should know to what point Avodah Zarah is baseless. On Yedeya Maked Eibishter, and every person, Al Pi Seichel, could see and understand the Eibishter is the only existence in the world. But in Dazak, but here the Rambam is saying that not necessarily, as Afilah the Umashi Yedasas Hashem, that even all the grandchildren of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, that was a nation that had this knowledge, nevertheless, it all fell apart, and they learned from the ways of the Mitzrayim around them. So here, the Rambam is making the point that actually to negate Avodah Zarah, this Umashi Yedasas Hashem, following in the footsteps of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, Al Pi Seichel, did not do it, is insufficient. So isn't that the opposite of the whole point that we're trying to say? That no, Dafka Al Pi Seichel, the pashtus, in a very simple sense, every person can come and understand, even if you just look around you, in creation itself, Welt itself will say this to you, that there's no Avodah Zarah, there's no other Metzias. So what's going on over here? Is this move on, so we can understand this, according to what the Rambam himself explains at the conclusion of this first Perek in Hilchos Avodah Zarah. This is what the Rambam says. Because the Eibishter loves us, Asam Moshe Rabbeinu Rabban Shakol Neviim. The Eibishter created and brought Moshe Rabbeinu, the Rebbe of all other prophets, v'sholchai, and he sent him to Yidden. When Moshe Rabbeinu prophesied, the Bach Hashem b'Yisrael l'nachla, then the Eibishter chose Yidden as his inheritance, Echtiram b'mitzvahs. He crowned them with mitzvahs, Vaydiyan derech avidasai, notified Yidden the way how to serve Hashem. Uma yeh mishpat avodah zarah v'chol hatoyim achareha. And what is the judgment for those that make a mistake and follow Avodah Zarah? The Rambam is the mitmadgish. And now here, with the Rambam concluding the entire Perek, where he emphasized so much about how much Avodah Zarah is baseless and Al Pi Seichel, but the conclusion of the Perek seems to be with a completely opposite point. And the Rambam is saying that this is as follows. Das was the Metzias von Avodah Zarah und Avodah. The fact that the entity of Avodah Zarah and serving it, be'eza oifen shehu, on any of the levels, afilu ba'ofen from Deir Enish, even on the most subtle and beginning and the highest degree of Avodah Zarah as it was in the generation of Enish, hot came it seisnit. All of this is just one big huge mistake, and there's no room for it at all, even logically. It's true. This is all understood, even with human nature, with human intellect. And it's something that you could understand and see as a fact, even if you just look at creation itself. Kanal has explained it well. That's all true. Und das ist negei zu wissen, als Akdame, Zulchas Avodah Zarah, and all this, as explained, is very important to know as an introduction to all the halachas of Avodah Zarah. Wie bald, das ist Peil, and Seichel Adam, Hakores Alakus, und Shlilas Avodah Zarah Kanal. Because only this way could you completely negate any trace of Avodah Zarah in a person's heart and mind, as explained at length. However, here the Rambam concludes and says, Zusammen damit, together with this, muss man wissen, one must know, as man kann nicht verlassen sich, bauen auf dem allein. You cannot rely and just build on this alone, just on Seichel itself. As ein Seichel soll sein der einzige Yesod, so abhalten sich von Avodah Zarah, that the person's intellect should be the only foundation that will hold him back for the Avodah Zarah. Und zu haben die Akaran Metzias und Dinim, and to have the proper recognition, Metzias Habayra, that is, in the proper recognition in Hashem, and to serve Hashem. Vimizetes, and here the Rambam says that I'll prove to you that intellect alone is not sufficient, as you see, von Yisrael B'Yamim Ahem, as it played out in history by Yidden in those times, as Nachdem wären an Ummah, she Yidasas Hashem, after Yidden were a nation that knows Hashem, is when Orcha Yom Yisrael b'Mitzrayim. Then, when there were many years of Yidden being in Mitzrayim, v'chazru l'umud masein v'lavid avodah zarah k'moisen chulu, Yidden came to learn from them. Chayzin b'nei Yaakov l'tas ha'olam l'tois ha'olam v'tayusa. So even b'nei Yaakov came to the same mistakes and the foolishness that the people made. Why is the Rambam saying all of this? He wants you to understand as follows: Kedei zu bavarnem von chet avodah zarah. In order to be sure that you won't have any connection to avodah zarah, haben sie gedacht, ankommen zu dem, was mir Avas Hashem my son. It's a love of Hashem for us. Asa Moshe Rabbeinu, Rabbi Shechol Neviim. He sends us Moshe Rabbeinu. V'sholchai, v'kimishin isnaba Moshe Rabbeinu, v'bachar Hashem Yisrael v'nachla. The Eibishter chooses us, hichtiron b'mitzvahs v'yidiyan derech avidasai. The Eibishter is the one that comes and crowns us with mitzvahs, and the Eibishter is the one that notifies us. Das heißt, as the kiyum is given mitzatzivi Hashem. To fulfill the mitzvahs and to not serve Avodah Zarah comes because the Eibishter commanded so. That's the only way to fully eradicate Avodah Zarah. It can't be just based on seichel. Und nicht nur die Akare in Metzias Habeire, nor euch Avedase, not only the recognition in the Creator, but also serving Hashem. Was euch das ist an ihnen, zu welchem es zugekommen bisman Avram. And even this, they came to in the time of Avram Avinu, durch der eigene Akara, they came then in their own recognition to the conclusion, She'ein roi lavid elul lekah ha'olam, that they should be serving only Hashem, v'loi roi l'shtachvis l'hakriv l'nasachul, they should be bowing and sacrificing for the Hashem alone. So even though they came to all of this by their own intellect, darf man wissen, but still at the same time you must know, as euch das ist verbunden mit divrei Hashem, that today, the fact that we don't serve Avodah Zarah and we serve only Hashem, it's the words of Hashem. Nuvuas Moshe Rabbeinu. It's a prophecy. That the Eibishter lets us know the way to serve Hashem. So we have over here a very important additional point that has to come together with the first point, that Avodah Zarah is totally negated al pi seichel. But yet at the same time, the only way that this can hold, the only way that this is real and full and complete, is when it's also, or maybe even primarily, based on the tzivi of Hashem, the nevuah of Moshe Rabbeinu. Then the recognition of a person al pi seichel will not fall apart as it did by the Yidden. And the Rabbi will elaborate more upon this later to explain why we need to have this foundation. So we can say that this additional detail that the Rambam points out here is also something which is not just a piece of history, but it's negei la'alocha. Even an individual, whereby him negating an existence of Avodah Zarah, und der Akare as by him is by him musig umuchach mitzara seichel, and he has this recognition very clear in seichel, in intellect. Darf from the kaim sein, nevertheless, he has to fulfill the mitzvahs. With tzivah Avodah Zarah, he has to fulfill the all mitzvahs, or the mitzvah and the command of Avodah Zarah, not to serve Avodah Zarah. Oich tu lois es shaba, dem nit dinen Avodah Zarah, mitzadem was haidiyam derech avidasai. That it's coming from above. It's coming because the Eibishter let us know that this is what it is. This is the truth of what it is. This is the truth beyond seichel. This is the truth of the Eibishter, that he let us know that we're connected to the real truth that comes from above, and that's why a Yid is not serve Avodah Zarah. So this is negeya b'poil in the the approach of a person. Why Avodah Zarah is so out of the question. It's not enough that it's out of the question just al pi seichel. The isser, the lav of Avodah Zarah, that it should be out of a person's machshava, has to be totally out, because Haidiyam, this is what David told us. We have the truth that was told for us. So this is a complete opposite emphasis over here. So in Sifyod, the Rebbe over here points out what we see over here in the Rambam, in Perek Aleph over here, these two opposite details that come out how you completely get rid of Avodah Zarah and Machshava. So now according to all this, it comes out. As in Perek Aleph and Hilchos Avodah Zarah bringt the Rambam areis zwei halachas. That with this whole arichas, even though it seems to be just a story of history, the Rambam is really teaching us over here two halachas. Aleph number 1, as the chet from Avodah Zarah is an inyan was is mufrich euch mitzad seichel ha'adam. To understand to what degree Avodah Zarah is baseless, that it's even in the intellect, human intellect, naturally, it's completely baseless. Und es darf be in besichloi this ames v'nikva werden, and only this way in a person's intellect, it has to be completely genuine and true, and has to be completely established in his mind. Die Abgefreckkeit und die Proteit zivuyim v'isurim Avodah Zarah. So this degree of how much Avodah Zarah is totally baseless and senseless has to be completely simple in a person's mind, just like he understands 2 + 2 = 4. That's one point there. Beis, but on the other hand, the Rambam continues and tells us and concludes, as the kiyum from the mitzvah b'payil, the way you actually fulfill the mitzvah of not serving Avodah Zarah b'payil, darf nicht sein geboit not of zenakarav idea. It can't be all based just on the person's own recognition. Not as all is ton the the person has to stay away from the opinions and approach of Avodah Zarah because of the truth that the Eibishter notified us. The Eibishter told us how to serve him. Weil der Eibishter hat das angesagt, sorry, because the Eibishter commanded us, Ade Moshe Rabbeinu, Rabbi shall call Nevi'im, the teacher of all Nevi'im, this haste. What the Rambam is saying with this is that Kiyim B'Payel, this, that a person actually stays away from Avodah Zarah, even though he knows it already, Al Pi Seichel, but nevertheless, fulfilling the actual mitzvah of staying away from Avodah Zarah, Dav Zayin Yusid, it has to be based on simple faith, which is above seichel. And if the yireh to oversein tzivi Hashem, and the fear to not transgress on a command from Hashem that comes from above. The tzivuye va isurei avodah zarah zen an etzad shlili. All the commands and the things that are forbidden of avodah zarah, that's the negative aspect. The things that you may not do or may not think about. Und der tzad chiyuvi shebezeh. But then the positive of this is the mitzvah sasef yediyas v'achtas Hashem. The flip side, the positive of all of this is the mitzvah of the knowledge to know Hashem and to know the oneness of Hashem. And wie the Rambam sagt, as the Rambam clearly says, as the Sefer Harishon for Sefer Hayad, that in the first Sefer, in the Sefer Hamad of Sefer Hayad, he says, Echle b'kol ha-mitzvahs, I'll include in it all the different mitzvahs, Shem ikke das Moshe Rabbeinu olav hashalom, which is the main religion of that Moshe Rabbeinu brought to Yidden, Kagain, Yichud Hashem Baruch Hu, the oneness of Hashem, V'Isurei Avodah Zarah, and the Isra Avodah Zarah, and V'Karas Hashem's Sefer Zeh, Sefer Hamada. So here we see in this lashon that Avodah Zarah is the opposite of the Yichud Hashem. Is Oich when I read the mitzvah sasei, when the Rambam speaks about the mitzvah sasei, the positive of knowing Hashem, brengt the Rambam the beide oibim the mountain yanam, the two details that we said before regarding Avodah Zarah, we see here also regarding the mitzvah of Yediyas Hashem. In Anfang Hilchos Yisaydiat Teire sagt the lashon leida sheyesham motzi rishon. The Rambam uses the expression one has to know that the Eibishter is the first existence. Leida sheyesham alakav. Or another expression he says to know that Hashem exists. As die Mitzvah besteht in Wissen und Verstehen beseichel as es verandert motzi rishon der alakav b'rei olam. To know and to understand logically the Creator of the world has to be something which is ingrained in your heart and mind. On Sefer HaMitzvahs, on the other hand, though, in the beginning of Sefer HaMitzvahs, sagt the Rambam dem Loshen, the Rambam there says, Tzivonu b'hamon asolakos, we're commanded to believe in Hashem, shenamen sheyeshem milah v'sibachulu, to believe that there's the first cause, the Eibishter that created. Their tzivui is, as mizol gloibin, the command is that we should believe, mitamunah, hechaf and seichel, the simple faith of a yid that's higher than seichel. In the Metzias from Ha'ilu v'Sibelakis. And this is what Hashem has commanded us and gave us from above, Haidiyam, as the Rabbi said before. And so this is the two details here we see also when it comes to our knowing Hashem. On one hand, it has to be real and deep and something that the person gets fully, but at the same time, that's not enough. Seichel is not enough. It has to be all based on the emunah that a Yid believes in Hashem. So here, Sif Yud Aleph, the Rebbe finishes off and explains all this on a deeper level. So based on this, we could understand on a deeper level as follows. Just like it is when it comes to the recognition and understanding the Creator of the world by the mitzvah saseh, when it comes to the positive, to the mitzvah, to know Hashem, is nit maspik to haben blois die idee in elokos. It's not enough just to have the knowledge to know Hashem with seichel. And the reason is, as the mensch is das machriach besichlehu, if the person is proving and understanding this with his own intellect, mit seichel, mitten seichel, kemen nemen, nor die beginne von elokos, was wird nimshach bebrinnes motzi rishon vu mamzi kol nimtza. If it's your seichel, if it's your intellect, you could only get and connect to a level of godliness. You only see godliness as something that could be defined, as something that we could understand with seichel. Das heißt, wie der Eibishter Kaviyachal is sich mit Samtzim zu haben a Sheiches zu Metzias Olam. This is a level of godliness which comes down and limits himself to be able to have a connection to an existence of a world, to interact with the world. Aber die Akkade in der Mitte der Metzies, von Holocaust, but to understand the true existence of Hashem, that Oyer Aleki, wie is Heche von Haben Shaykhs zur Welt, to understand the true revelation of who Hashem is, that's beyond any definition, anything that we could describe, that's perfect and great and holy in definitions that we have al Piseichel. But the true existence of Hashem is beyond any of that. Das kemen nemen, that is nor mit amuna. That's something that we could only connect to, we could only take and have a connection to through belief. This is lamai lama seichel, higher than seichel. Right, so here the Rebbe is pointing out the pnimi sanyanim, what it says in Chassidus, that the difference between seichel and not seichel is what level of godliness you're connecting to. As is das in the tzad von shlila, the same thing is also in the negative. In the tzivuye v'isurei avodah zarah, when it comes to the commands and the isra avodah zarah. As nit blois ze'ekiyim b'poyel daf nit zayin geboit nor of seichel. It's not only that when you come to actually fulfill the mitzvah, it should be not only with seichel alone, but you have to have another foundation. And additionally, as was explained before, noroich, there's a deeper point here. Das was es darf bei ihm nis ames werden besichle der heder hametzies v'achshivus von jede zach eisodayibsten. This, that by every person has to be very clear, factually, the truth, how there's nothing that has any existence and any significance besides Hashem. Definitely the lower levels of Avodah Zarah. Even this itself, what a person understands al Piseichel, is nit genug when she's no mitzad seichel. It's not enough when a person gets all of this with a clarity, but it's all just logically. Vile, and the reason is, Neusuf of then, in addition to the following point there, as be'es, nor zayin seichel is the yesod. If a person's intellect is the only basis for his understanding, can gemalt sein as zayin mushka a ribu zman in Welt, so then it's possible that being immersed an extended period of time in the mitzias of the world, on in the matters of the world, hat the mitzias from Welt v'chol ha'shayach lo ya'ashpa u'pa'ule. So the existence of the world and things that there are in the world will have an influence and an effect on the person, und sich misgabe oiv zayin seichel, and it'll be even more powerful as an influence on him, even more than his intellect is an influence on the person. To the point that this leads to the lowest and lowest places that the person could serve Avodah Zarah. This is given by the Yidden in Mitzrayim, as it was with the Yidden in Mitzrayim, as Mitzadzev, as Orcha Yom, they were there for a long period of time. Is Chazru Lumad Masayin Valavid Avodah Zarah Kamaisam. They ended up serving Avodah Zarah like them. So that's one simple point why Seichel is insufficient, because there are other influences. Seichel is a certain koyach that has a tremendous influence. It's the most powerful koyach in a person, Seichel, that identifies a person, and when you understand it, I'll be Seichel, this is me, this is what I understand. But at the same time, there are other very strong influences that can pull a person away. But additionally, in connection to the point that was said before, Seichel Adam is a metzias. A person's intellect is an entity, a defined entity, a metzias, nivres, mugbeles, a created, limited entity. The Rebbe hat Seichel nit bekoyach to shoyle zayin the metzias and Avram betachlis hashlila. Seichel alone cannot negate Avodah Zarah completely. Daf given us kommt mitzad atzivi von dem Eibishter. So therefore, it's only when this comes from a command from Hashem, ubederach hamunah, and a person is negating Avodah Zarah with faith in Hashem. Only then can a person really come to the true understanding of the Eibishter as Yede Mitzias Ulosso Yizbarach is Mushal B'Tachlis. Then you can come to a much deeper understanding how everything is completely negated, how there's no other existence other than Hashem. Seichel will never tell you fully that the existence of the world is totally insignificant and totally nothing. Seichel is part of the Mitzias of the world. It's only a munah that can give you that full understanding that there's nothing other than Hashem, the real truth of the Einoid Mulvade. That's why there has to be the munah as well, which is the second point that the Rambam concludes with in Perek Aleph of Hilchas Avodah Zarah.